Elliot Carter had always been searching for something. Not just answers, not just knowledge, but a connection. A thread to tie him to the past, to make sense of the present, to give meaning to the future. He had grown up feeling like an outsider, a quiet boy with his nose buried in history books, dreaming of a world where he could belong. And now, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment in the heart of New Orleans, he felt closer to that dream than ever before. In his hands was the diary of Marie Laveau, the legendary Voodoo queen. It was more than just a book. It was a key to a world he had only ever read about. A world of magic, of mystery, of power. But as he opened the diary and began to read, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air in the room grew heavy, the shadows on the walls seeming to shift and twist. The words on the page seemed to glow faintly, and for a moment, Elliot thought he heard a whisper. A voice, soft and distant, speaking words he couldn't understand. Beneath the crescent moon, where the dead walk and the living fear to tread, lies the truth of my power and my curse. Beware, for those who seek my secrets may find more than they bargained for. Elliot's heart raced as he read the words aloud. He had spent his life searching for answers, but now, as the weight of the diary's secrets settled over him, he couldn't help but wonder, had he found what he was looking for, or had he stumbled into something far beyond his understanding? The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Elliot woke to find his apartment in disarray. Books had been pulled from the shelves, their pages torn and scattered. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something else, something earthy and decayed. At first, Elliot thought it was a break-in, but nothing was missing. In fact, the only thing out of place was the diary, which sat open on his desk, its pages turned to a passage he didn't remember reading. The spirits are restless. They hunger for justice, and they will not be silenced. Elliot's unease grew as he stepped outside. The streets of the French Quarter were quieter than usual, the usual bustle of tourists and street performers replaced by an eerie stillness. The air was thick with fog, and the gas lamps flickered as though struggling to stay lit. As he walked, Elliot noticed strange things, shadows that moved without owners, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and everywhere the faint scent of grave soil and burning herbs. That evening, Elliot found himself drawn to Jackson Square. The square was usually alive with music and laughter, but tonight it was deserted. The only sound was the distant tolling of a church bell. As he stood there, a figure emerged from the shadows, a street performer, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He played a haunting melody on his violin, the notes echoing through the empty square. Elliot felt a chill run down his spine as the man stopped playing and turned to face him. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. "You've opened a door best left closed, boy," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "She's coming for you." Before Elliot could respond, the man vanished into the fog, leaving only the echo of his words behind. Desperate for answers, Elliot sought out Mama Jolene, a local voodoo priestess known for her wisdom and connection to the spirit world. Her shop was tucked away in a quiet corner of the quarter, its windows filled with candles, bones, and jars of mysterious substances. Mama Jolene listened intently as Elliot explained what had happened. When he showed her the diary, her expression grew grave. "Child, you've stirred a hornet's nest," she said, her voice heavy with warning. "Marie Laveau's curse is tied to a secret she buried long ago, a betrayal, a stolen relic, and a pact with forces beyond the grave. The spirits are restless, and they won't rest until justice is served." Mama Jolene explained the history of the curse. Decades ago, Marie Laveau had been betrayed by a man she trusted, a fellow practitioner of voodoo who sought to steal her power. He had taken a sacred relic, a talisman imbued with the spirits of her ancestors, and used it for his own dark purposes. In her fury, Marie had cursed him and the relic, binding their fates together. The man had disappeared, but the relic remained, hidden away in the swamps outside the city. Over the years, many had tried to find it, but none had succeeded. And now Elliot had unwittingly awakened the curse by disturbing Marie's diary. That night, Elliot and Mama Jolene ventured into the swamps outside the city. The air was thick with the sounds of crickets and the croaking of frogs, but as they moved deeper, the sounds faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The swamp seemed alive, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was soft and wet, each step sinking into the muck, and everywhere the faint glow of will-o'-the-wisps danced in the darkness. As they neared the burial site, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air was cold, and the whispers Elliot had heard before grew louder, more insistent. "You are not welcome here," the voices hissed. "Leave, or face the consequences." But Elliot pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. At last they reached the site, a small, moss-covered mound with a single gnarled tree growing from its center. Elliot began to dig, his hands trembling as he unearthed an ornate box, its surface etched with symbols that matched those in the diary. But as he lifted it from the ground, the swamp erupted in chaos. The ground shook, and ghostly figures emerged from the mist, their eyes glowing with rage. They circled Elliot and Mama Jolene, their voices a cacophony of anger and despair. "What do they want?" Elliot cried, clutching the box to his chest. "To test your resolve," Mama Jolene replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Prove you're worthy of breaking the curse." Elliot closed his eyes, focusing on the incantation he had memorized from the diary. His voice shook as he recited the words, but he didn't stop. The spirits howled, the wind whipping around him, and for a moment it seemed as though all was lost. But then, silence. The spirits vanished and the swamp fell still. The box in Elliot's hands crumbled to dust, its power spent. Mama Jolene placed a hand on his shoulder, a faint smile on her lips. "It is done," she said. "The curse is lifted." Back in the French Quarter, life returned to normal. The fog lifted, the music played, and the streets were alive once more. But Elliot knew he would never forget what he had seen. As he sat on a bench in Jackson Square, staring at the diary in his hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past was still watching him. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And as the crescent moon shone brightly in the night sky, a faint whisper echoed through the air. The dead never forget. The legend of Marie Laveau lives on in the shadows of the French Quarter, where the past is always waiting to be awakened. Elliot returned to his apartment that night, exhausted but relieved. The curse was lifted, the relic destroyed, and the spirits appeased. Or so he thought. As he lay in bed, the diary resting on his nightstand, he heard it, a faint scratching at his window. He sat up, his heart pounding, and turned to look. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale, gaunt, and unmistakably angry. Its eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, and its lips moved as if speaking, though no sound came through. Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the scratching continued, moving now to the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He reached for the diary, his hands trembling, and opened it to a page he had never seen before. The words were written in a shaky hand, the ink fresh and dark, as though they had just been penned. "You think it is over, but it has only just begun. The dead do not forget, and they do not forgive. The curse is eternal, and so am I." Elliot's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The curse was never truly broken. It had only shifted, its weight now resting squarely on his shoulders. And as the scratching grew louder, the whispers more insistent, Elliot knew one thing for certain. Marie Laveau's story was far from over. In the shadows of the French Quarter, where the past is always watching, the dead never sleep, and neither would he. The dead never forget. And now this next story begins. In the 1990s, New Orleans' French Quarter, this was a place of vibrant nightlife, jazz music, and Mardi Gras celebrations. But beneath the surface of this lively city, a dark and terrifying chapter was unfolding, one that would leave a permanent scar on the soul of the Crescent City. Imagine walking down Bourbon Street, the air thick with the scent of beignets and the sound of trumpets echoing through the night. The streets are alive with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. But for some, the night doesn't end with celebration. For some, it ends in silence, in darkness, in unimaginable horror. This is the story of the Bourbon Street Ripper, a killer who preyed on the vulnerable, who turned the heart of New Orleans into a hunting ground, and who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions, fear, and the ghosts of those who were lost. The victims of the Bourbon Street Ripper were often individuals who had been marginalized or overlooked by society. Many were sex workers, struggling to make ends meet in the shadowy corners of the French Quarter. Others were runaways or homeless individuals, people who had fallen through the cracks and were easy targets for a predator. What they shared in common was their vulnerability. They were people who wouldn't be immediately missed, whose disappearances might not raise alarms right away. This made them the perfect prey for a killer who thrived on anonymity and terror. But who was the Bourbon Street Ripper? Descriptions from the few who claimed to have seen the killer were inconsistent, yet chilling. Some witnesses described a tall, gaunt figure dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat or a hood. Others spoke of a figure who moved with an unnatural grace, gliding through the shadows like a specter. One witness, a bartender who worked late nights on Bourbon Street, claimed to have seen the Ripper standing at the edge of an alley, staring directly at them with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. When the bartender blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only a faint, acrid smell in the air, like burnt flesh and damp earth. Another witness, a street performer, recalled hearing faint whispers behind them as they packed up their instruments late one night. When they turned, they saw a shadowy figure holding what appeared to be a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, it just stood there, watching, before melting into the darkness. The killer's methods were as horrifying as they were precise. Victims were often lured into secluded areas with promises of money or shelter, only to meet a gruesome end. The Ripper didn't just kill, they reveled in the act, leaving behind scenes that were as much about terror as they were about death. Marie Laveau, one of the earliest victims, was a 24-year-old sex worker known for her kindness and her dream of one day leaving the streets behind. Her body was found in a narrow alley off Bourbon Street, her throat slit and strange symbols carved into her skin, crude, jagged marks that seemed to form a pattern, though their meaning was never deciphered. Her body was posed in a grotesque manner, her head tilted back as if she were screaming silently into the night. Friends remembered Marie as someone who always had a smile and a kind word, even in the hardest of times. Her death left a void in the tight-knit community of sex workers who began to fear for their lives. One of Marie's friends later recalled a chilling detail. The night before her death, Marie had mentioned a new client who had promised her a large sum of money for a private meeting. She had described the man as oddly quiet and cold to the touch, but she had brushed it off, desperate for the cash. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Jesse Morales, a 19-year-old runaway, had come to New Orleans from a small town in Texas, hoping to escape a troubled home life. He had been living on the streets, occasionally finding work as a busboy or panhandling to get by. Jesse's body was discovered near the banks of the Mississippi River, not far from the French Quarter. His hands had been bound with coarse rope, and his face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The killer had left behind a single playing card, the ace of spades, placed carefully on his chest. It was a chilling signature, one that hinted at a mind both calculating and cruel. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was the faint trace of lipstick on Jesse's forehead, as if the Ripper had kissed him before ending his life. Friends described Jesse as a gentle soul who loved music and dreamed of one day becoming a performer. His death was a stark reminder that no one was safe. One of Jesse's friends later claimed to have seen him talking to a shadowy figure near Jackson Square the night he disappeared. The figure had been wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low over their face, and Jesse had seemed nervous but willing to follow. When the friend called out to him, Jesse had turned and waved, saying, "It's okay. I'll be back soon." He never returned. Denise Carter, a 32-year-old mother of two, had turned to sex work after losing her job. She had been trying to get her life back on track, but her dreams were cut short when she became another of the Ripper's victims. Her body was found in an abandoned building, her wrists slashed and her body mutilated in ways that suggested the killer had taken their time. Police discovered strange, almost ritualistic arrangements of objects around her. Candles, broken mirrors, and a small doll with its face smeared with what appeared to be blood. It was as if the Ripper was staging a macabre altar, a twisted performance meant to terrify anyone who stumbled upon it. Denise's children were left without a mother, and her death became a symbol of the Ripper's cruelty. One investigator later recalled that the scene felt deliberately theatrical, as if the killer was trying to send a message. The broken mirrors in particular seemed to hold some significance, though no one could decipher their meaning. Some speculated that the Ripper was obsessed with reflections, perhaps seeing themselves as a distorted version of humanity. Marcus Dupree, a 27-year-old street performer, had been a familiar face in the Quarter, playing his guitar for tips. Marcus was known for his infectious smile and his love of music, but his life ended in a dark alley, his body bearing the same brutal marks as the others. His guitar strings had been used to strangle him, and his instrument was smashed to pieces beside him. The killer had left behind a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The music dies tonight." It was a taunt, a reminder that the Ripper was always watching, always listening. Marcus had been a beacon of joy in the Quarter, and his death left a silence that was felt by everyone who knew him. One of Marcus's fellow performers later recalled a chilling encounter the night before his death. Marcus had mentioned a strange man who had been watching him perform for several nights in a row. The man never clapped or smiled, just stood at the edge of the crowd, staring intently. Marcus had joked about it at the time, saying, "Maybe he's my biggest fan." But his friend had noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes. The murders were gruesome and methodical, each one more horrifying than the last. Victims were often found in alleyways or abandoned buildings, their bodies bearing signs of extreme violence. The French Quarter, with its narrow streets and hidden corners, provided the perfect hunting ground for the Ripper. Witnesses reported seeing a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, but descriptions were vague and inconsistent. Some claimed the killer wore dark clothing and moved with an unnatural grace, while others said they heard faint whispers or laughter before the figure vanished into the night. One witness swore they saw the Ripper's eyes glowing faintly in the dark, like a predator stalking its prey. Another claimed to have heard the killer humming a tune, a distorted version of a popular jazz song, as they disappeared into the shadows. As the body count rose, so did the fear. The Ripper's victims were often left in plain sight, as if the killer was taunting the police and the public. The French Quarter, once a place of joy and revelry, became a place of dread. bars and clubs saw fewer patrons, and the streets grew quieter as people stayed indoors, afraid to venture out after dark. The media sensationalized the killings, dubbing the perpetrator the Bourbon Street Ripper, a name that sent chills through the city. Rumors began to spread. Some claimed the Ripper was a ghost, a vengeful spirit haunting the quarter. Others whispered that the killer was a local, someone who blended in seamlessly with the crowds, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One particularly chilling rumor suggested that the Ripper was a former doctor, someone who knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain without leaving behind obvious clues. The New Orleans Police Department launched a massive investigation, following countless leads and interviewing numerous suspects. They even consulted psychics in their desperate search for answers. But the Ripper was always one step ahead, leaving behind no clear evidence or clues. The killer's identity remained a mystery, and the case grew colder with each passing year. Some believe the Ripper left New Orleans, moving on to another city or state. Others think the killer may have died or been imprisoned for unrelated crimes. But the truth is, no one knows for sure. Today, the French Quarter has returned to its vibrant self, with tourists and locals alike filling the streets day and night. But for those who lived through the terror of the 1990s, the memory of the Bourbon Street Ripper lingers. The victims, Marie, Jesse, Denise, Marcus, and others, are not forgotten. They were people with dreams, struggles, and stories whose lives were tragically cut short. The question remains, who was the Bourbon Street Ripper? And could they still be out there, waiting in the shadows? As the sun sets over the Mississippi River and the gas lamps flicker to life, the French Quarter transforms once more into a place of mystery and shadows. The laughter and music still fill the air, but there's an undercurrent of unease, a whisper of something darker. Some say the Ripper never left, that they're still here, blending into the crowds, watching, waiting. Others believe the killer's spirit haunts the quarter, a restless presence that lingers in the alleys and abandoned buildings, forever searching for their next victim. And so the legend of the Bourbon Street Ripper endures, a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always leave. Sometimes it stays, sometimes it waits. And on quiet nights when the jazz fades and the streets empty, you might feel it, a cold breath on the back of your neck, a whisper in the dark, a reminder that the past never truly dies and that some horrors are never meant to be forgotten.